And the third primary reason why the early church was not the Eastern Orthodox Church is because the Christian church in its earliest ages, contrary to the claims of the Eastern Orthodox Church, absolutely did not venerate icons. Now, many who watch this video may already be familiar with the Baptist theologian Dr. Gavin Ortlund and his well-known video on this exact topic. And there's nothing I'm about to say in my video here that hasn't already been covered by his video more than 3 years beforehand. So those who are interested in a greater in-depth study of this topic would do well to watch his video in its entirety. But for the sake of our video here today, I will provide merely a few examples showing, as I've said, that the early church absolutely did not venerate icons. Far from venerating icons, the vast majority of the earliest Christians promoted iconoclast views that objected to the use of any images whatsoever in the worship of the triune God. Many preserved writings from the first few centuries after the resurrection of Christ either explicitly condemn the use of images in worship or speak critically of non-Christian sects who use images in the worship of their false gods. Examples of Christians of the former category who explicitly condemned images include Marcus Minucius Felix in his Octavius Discourse, who, through the use of a non-Christian character, indirectly acknowledges that Christians did not worship with images, endeavoring with such pains to conceal and cloak whatever they worship. Others include Clement of Alexandria, who states that works of art cannot be sacred and divine, as well as his student Origen, who notes that Christians avoid images and would rather die than debase the Most High God by any such, that being the use of images, along with temples and altars. At this point, many Eastern Orthodox will object, stating that Origen's rejection of icon veneration proves that icon veneration is true because Origen was condemned as a heretic by later ecumenical councils. Those Eastern Orthodox who make this objection fail to realize that they are committing one of the most obvious cases of the genetic fallacy that can be brought forth. The genetic fallacy is committed when someone discredits an argument, not because of the merits of the argument itself, but because of where that argument comes from, when in reality, where that argument comes from has no relevance as to whether or not the argument itself is true. In this case, these Eastern Orthodox commit the genetic fallacy by insisting that icon veneration is true because Origen believes it to be false. Origen was condemned for his views on universalism and strange articulations of the Trinity, but he was not condemned for his view on icons. Therefore, for these reasons, Origen serves as a credible and valuable witness against the practice of icon veneration in the early church. Examples of Christians who fall into the latter category by speaking critically of non-Christians who do use images include Justin Martyr, who, in his first apology, criticizes pagans who sacrifice to idols. But Justin doesn't consider these practices wicked simply because they're being made to false gods instead of the true God. He considers them wicked because, in his own words, it is not only irrational, but an insult to God, whose glory and form are inevitable, to give his name to corruptible things which themselves need care. In other words, the pagans not only err in failing to worship the true God, but they also err in thinking that the immeasurably glorious God can be conceived or depicted in a material manner through the use of images. Similarly, Athenagoras of Athens, in his Embassy for the Christians, criticizes the multitude for praying to idols and defends the Christians who don't on the principle that the multitude cannot distinguish between matter and God, whereas Christians do separate the uncreated and the created. Not only is it wrong to use images in worship because they were being used to worship false gods, it's just as wrong to use images in worship because it is an unfitting way to approach the glorious and uncreated God. And even Irenaeus, in his classic work Against Heresies, when describing the Carpocratian heretics, notes in passing that one of the defining features of their heretical sect was that they possessed images, some of them painted, others formed, and even appeared to justify these actions by appealing to claims of the likeness of Christ being made by men such as Pontius Pilate. Such images were crowned and honored in other ways by these Gnostic heretics. This description becomes far more interesting when one considers that Irenaeus, throughout all of Against Heresies, which is a massive work, not once describes the Christian religion as one that explicitly implements the use of images in worship. The only time Irenaeus explicitly mentions images in this matter is, again, to describe the key tenets of heretical groups that he's refuting. Every single one of the church fathers just cited was born before 200 AD, testifying that since the earliest time after the resurrection of Christ, the Christian church did not worship with images. And in case anyone were to dismiss any of these church fathers on the grounds that they are just one individual's opinion or perspective, we can also provide our case from authoritative gatherings of bishops and presbyters within the church, such as the Synod of Elvira, which convened nearly 20 years before the Council of Nicaea. Canon 36 of the Synod of Elvira declared that images should not be in churches so that what is venerated and worshiped not be painted on the walls. Though Eastern Orthodoxy may not accept this canon as binding on the grounds that it is not an ecumenical council, it nevertheless further demonstrates the early church's stance against the use of images in worship, a stance which is entirely disregarded by the modern Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, some Eastern Orthodox will object at this point, claiming that the reason why the early church in the first few centuries after Christ didn't use images in worship is because of the intense persecution that they suffered at the hands of the Roman Empire. Using images would be an obvious way for the authorities to identify Christians and have them executed. Thus, as the objection states, the early church refrained from images not because they weren't the practice of the apostles, but simply because they posed threats to Christian safety. It was only until after Christianity became legalized in the year 313 AD in the Edict of Milan that icons and other images supposedly began to be embraced by the church at large. But this objection fails for two primary reasons. First, if the veneration of icons was truly the practice of the apostles, then the claim that the church after the time of the apostles would refrain from such veneration because of Roman persecution becomes an extremely weak reason to excuse their failure to abide by the practice, since the apostles themselves lived under the same Roman Empire and faced similar levels of persecution, yet still would have venerated icons anyways. But secondly, and much more importantly, we know that persecution was not the reason why the early church refrained from venerating icons, and the reason why we know this is because the church continued to practice iconoclasm even after Christianity became legalized. This was not only the case in the Western Church with figures such as Augustine, but it is also true within the Eastern Church. One notable example of this from the Eastern Church after the legalization of Christianity in Rome is again Epiphanius of Salamis. Epiphanius, living after the Edict of Milan, recalls a time in which he visited a church, and upon noticing that the church contained a curtain which bore the image of Christ or one of the saints, he tore it down on the principle that depicting images of man in church is contrary to the teaching of the Scriptures. In the same letter, he also notes that such depictions are occasions of offense that are unworthy of the Church of Christ. It is certainly true that as time continued on, the church would slowly and gradually come to embrace the use of images in worship, ultimately reaching a point of climax in the controversy of venerating icons. But as these examples demonstrate, the practice of venerating icons is not apostolic and was not recognized as such in the earliest times of the Christian church. Nevertheless, despite the abundance of evidence in support of the iconoclast position, the Second Council of Nicaea in the year 787 AD, recognized as an infallible ecumenical council by the Eastern Orthodox Church, by the way, insisted that the veneration of icons was indeed an apostolic practice. In other words, the church that claims to retain the faith of the apostles anathematizes people for refusing to abide by a practice that the apostles and the early church never practiced during their own day and age. And if you wish to be consistent with the earliest Christians' view as it relates to iconography, then you should not become a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, a communion which dogmatically commands adherents under threats of anathema to practice that which was explicitly rejected by the earliest Christians. And although this video is about the Eastern Orthodox Church in particular, it's also relevant here to mention that icon veneration is also dogmatically enforced within the Roman Catholic Church. Although Roman Catholics at the very least can concede that icon veneration does not date back to the time of the apostles through their unique articulation of doctrinal development, their communion nevertheless embraces Nicaea II as an infallible ecumenical council which, like the Eastern Orthodox Church, dogmatically commands the acceptance of icon veneration under the threat of anathema. And in the cases of those Roman Catholics who do admit icon veneration is not explicitly apostolic and claims that Nicaea II does not necessitate one to believe the same, the concerns are not alleviated, as such a position concedes that the Roman Catholic Church, through the dogma of Nicaea II, binds the consciences of its members to embrace a doctrine which is conceded to have not been explicitly from the apostles themselves.